everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to another one of our online events. We are very happy to have with us today Robert Gordon-Fogelson. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History at the University of Southern California and the recipient of the Visual Studies graduate certificate. He works on 20th century design, architecture, and material culture with a focus on relationships between design and businesses, discourse and practice, and production and distribution. And his dissertation, Total Integration, Design, Business, and Society in the United States, 1935 to 1985, examines the centrality of integration as a concept to mid-20th century design. And Robert was also our 2019 Cary Summer Research Fellow. So he was here very recently. And today he will be presenting on creativity and control towards a systems theory of design.
So yes, thank you, Shani. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today. And a special thank you to everyone at the Cary for, Steve, Amelia, Shani, and Ella, for your really generous support of my research. It's been a really wonderful experience to be a part of this intellectual community, and I'm excited to finally be able to share, the sort of fruits of my research with you today. This paper is a sort of direct result of my research from the Cary in the fall. So it's really brand new work that I'm looking forward to discussing with all of you today. Okay. The integration of creative urge and knowledge based on sober facts is important if we want to control a design. This declaration comes from designer Will Burtin's speech at the reception for his exhibition, Integration, the New Discipline in Design, which opened at Chicago's Buncho Library in September 1949. This was the second stop of the exhibition, which was first shown at New York's 80 Gallery in November 1948. Burtin's aim, as indicated by the show's title, was to develop a systematic approach to design as a way of combining visual components into larger wholes. Here I'm showing you one example of the kinds of systematic techniques that Burtin applied to visual communications. You see an entire issue of Fortune laid out page by page on the right, and on the left is Burtin's attempt to explain graphically how the interchange and rhythm of elements, color, drawings, photography, and typography helps to avoid monotony, maintain flow, and spotlight salient information. And just another example of a plan for a film on antibiotics, broken down by image, sound, and speed over time, to emphasize that this really was, at least in theory, a systematic approach that was transferable across media. Now, Burtin was very much sensitive to the fact that his proposed discipline of integrated design conflicted, potentially, with the prevailing notion of the designer as a creative individual, or as he put it, quote, the fanatically defended idea of the creative man, who cannot be held responsible, cannot adopt discipline, who is hundreds of years beyond his time, end quote. This was, after all, the beginning of a period marked by considerable anxiety regarding the impacts of large organizations on social life, a period in which social and cultural critics advanced the notion that a culture of conformity, collectivism, and control was inhibiting our human capacity for critical thinking and individual action. Yet these anxieties were, Burtin believed, based on flawed reasoning and outmoded definitions of both discipline and creativity, which set them at opposite ends of a spectrum of human activity. In his notes for an ultimately unrealized book project that would have served as an extension of the integration exhibition, Burtin argued that an element of control could stimulate rather than stymie creative urges by giving them form, process, and a social function. Quote, discipline is not the end, but the means of education, of any accomplishment. The function of design is not the stifling of creative impulses, but their becoming part of a living social concept. Discipline is integration, end quote. In this talk, I'll be exploring the fate of creativity in corporate design from the 1950s to the 1970s, a period marked by the rise of systems theory, computer science, and other modes of regulatory thinking. We'll be taking a look at some corporate design manuals from the Cary's collection to see how designers adapted these modes of thought to design practice. Ultimately, I'll argue that by transforming integrated design into a visual system of its own, complete with carefully developed and maintained graphic standards, operating procedures, and usage restrictions, designers reimagined creativity not only as the invention of new forms or ideas, but also, perhaps even primarily, as the controlled combination of existing elements. The International Design Conference in Aspen, conceived by designer Egbert Jacobson in 1950 as a forum for explaining the concept of integrated design, became an important meeting point for designers and systems theorists during the 1950s and 60s. Burtin played a central role in introducing systems theory to Aspen. As program chairman of the Fifth Conference in 1955, he included among the speakers Lancelot Law White, a Scottish philosopher and physicist engaged in the development and promotion of a unitary principle of scientific inquiry. In his talk, White discussed a shift in the sciences from atomistic to systematic thinking. While the doctrine of atomism advanced a view of natural design as the summation of the movements of individual particles, White identified an increasing cross-disciplinary awareness that scientific phenomena are determined primarily by systems of relations. Scientists, he observed, were, quote, increasingly concerned with the collective properties of complex systems containing many entities, and have found themselves emphasizing the importance of symmetry, structure, pattern, order, organization, form, end quote. White's talk was essentially a summation of Austrian biologist Ludwig von Bertalanffy's general system theory. Although initially conceived as a specifically scientific discipline, or interdiscipline, Bertalanffy extrapolated further, noting that systems thinking was evident in the social sciences and humanities too. Historical inquiry, for example, appeared to have shifted from a focus on individual decisions and actions to sociocultural forces. Almost any discipline, it seemed, could be submitted to the explanatory and predictive power of the system. It was no surprise then that designers such as Burtin or Charles Eames, seen here in the Aspen audience perched rapturously on the edge of his seat, found in systems theory a model for how to render their work more methodical and practicable. The implications for corporate design were twofold. First, systems thinking reinforced the concept of design not as a series of discrete objects or images, but rather as a total visual environment or identity that could be managed by a basic set of transferable design principles. Second, it legitimized efforts to identify structural correlations, what Bertalanffy called isomorphisms, between the operations of designers and corporations. In other words, corporate design, if approached as a systematic discipline, could be made more intelligible to the corporate designer and more easily applicable to the work of corporate management. The question remained, however, what happens to the designer as a creative individual under this regulatory framework? White sought to make systems theory more accessible and acceptable for his audience in Aspen by likening the systems theorist's concern with structure, order, and interrelation to the designer's interest in form, pattern, and integration. Quote, art and science, philosophy and religion, engineering and medicine, indeed all cultural activities are based on the ordering of experience and the exploitation of the resulting design. Aesthetic, spontaneous components and deliberate, systematic components are both present in nearly all human activities, end quote. White defined design not simply as a process of invention then, but also of organization. Art and science, spontaneity, creativity, and control. These were all indivisible and indispensable to the designer. Now, at this point, I'd like to take us beyond Aspen to explore how systems theory permeated post-war design thinking and how designers confronted and expressed these concepts in the form of a systematic approach to corporate design. Lester Beall, a designer based on the East Coast and far removed from the Aspen network, nevertheless participated in the discourse around systems, automation, and visual integration. At the opening of the American Institute of Graphic Arts 1952 Printing for Commerce exhibition, Beall described the designer as, quote, a force for the integration of all the visual factors inherent in a problem, end quote. Yet Beall's attitude towards integrated design was conflicted. Integration is a wonderful word, he confessed, but he also believed that it failed to capture the more nebulous yet vital elements of the creative process. Quote, if he just makes things work without any spark, without any fire, or fails to equip his visualization with wings, then he's only an integrator and not a designer, end quote. And I'll note too that George Solomon opened his review of this exhibition with the observation that, quote, if American design is on the road towards standardization, the show gives no inkling of such a calamity. Variety in style and approach is as great as ever, end quote. So the idea of the creative individual as inimical to discipline alive and well here in 1952. Beall's own skepticism is evident in a talk entitled A Plea for the Individual and Individuality, in which he identifies a paradox inherent in corporate design, the struggle between the individual initiative of the designer and the group anonymity of the corporation. This contest between ingenuity and conformity, individuality and collectivity, was waged not only vis-a-vis the machine, as in the pre-war period, but also in relation to the computer, a new kind of data processing machine. Indeed, Beall's talk teemed with references to a post-war intellectual milieu dominated by the rise of systems theory, cybernetics, and computerization. He conjured up the image of, quote, an automatic think world that will erase the individual as a sensory perceptive apparatus, end quote, thereby casting corporations such as IBM, with its famous slogan, think, as the architects of a new world order in which computers replaced human brains as the nerve centers overseeing social interactions. Perhaps most presciently, Beall warned that a growing reliance on computer processes would, quote, inevitably create a society of lookalikes, end quote. He thus warned of the possibility that under the new regime of computer-aided capitalist aesthetics, corporations and humans alike would become visually identical and interchangeable. Rather than simply observe these transformations, Beall urged designers to intervene, not by resisting the rise of systems thinking, but rather by fusing it with the combinatory logic of integrated design. And just as earlier designers had sought to control rather than reject machines, Beall envisioned a synthesis of human and computer that would transform the designer into a sort of cyborg, a, quote, wandering sensory apparatus, detecting experiences, absorbing some, deflecting others, but building up a wealth of human phenomena, end quote. In other words, designers had to assimilate and thereby humanize the language of systems if they hoped to maintain control over creative decision-making in the computer age. Beall was a relatively early contributor to the systematization of corporate design through his work on graphic standards and identification systems. In the 1950s, he joined a team of architects and designers hired by Fraser Wilde, president of the Connecticut General Life Insurance Company, to update the company's visual identity. Initially tasked with designing a new corporate symbol, Beall ultimately produced a complete integrated design program, which was subsequently published in the 1958 Connecticut General Style Book. The Style Book represented an early stage in the development of the corporate design manual, an object type that became indispensable for organizations seeking to implement comprehensive visual systems. The term Style Book itself quickly became outdated as corporate designers gravitated toward more technical terminology. Connecticut General Style Book also differed from later manuals in its very materiality. Like other early examples, it was a slim spiral bound volume, whereas later manuals were typically housed in plastic binders with mechanical bindings, capable of expansion as the company and its design program grew. The ways in which corporate design manuals dealt with issues of authorship, pedagogy, and standardization also evidenced changing ideas about creativity and design during the 1950s and 60s. One of the main ways that Connecticut General's style book differed from later manuals was its assertion of an authorial voice as a way to legitimize its contents. The book contained not just Beall's name, but also a lengthy biographical sketch. The text included information about Beall's design training, career trajectory, clientele, and honors. It also referenced his publications, talks, and exhibitions, as well as the professional associations in which he was involved. It portrayed him, in other words, not simply as a skilled designer, but also a highly active and well-connected professional, characteristics that might have held particular value for the organization men and women who would have used the style book to maintain Connecticut General's visual identity. Beall's style book also had a strong pedagogical component, evidence perhaps of the designer's efforts to establish underlying principles for an area of practice that was still largely absent from design school curricula. In addition to sections detailing the specific components of a corporate style, including trademark type and color, the book also contained an introduction that sought to theorize how visual design functioned optically. Beall identified three basic visual properties inherent in all graphic design: form, texture, and color. By manipulating these essential elements, the designer created the illusion of planes, which, if properly interrelated, determined the workability of the whole design. To clarify his meaning, Beall included this hypothetical cross-section of a design in which the gaze of a disembodied eye appears to penetrate two red planes, marked A and B, along its path to the black plane of the paper's surface. Altering the size, color, or texture of either red plane threatened to dissociate them from each other or from the paper, thereby jeopardizing the communicative efficiency of the design as a whole. This kind of speculative design pedagogy was entirely absent from later manuals, which focused on practicable solutions to design problems rather than abstract visual theory. Perhaps most importantly, Beall's style book was significantly less constraining in its standards than later corporate design manuals. Despite noting that, quote, a company symbol must be consistently applied within the framework of an accepted trademark policy, end quote, Beall presented the CG symbol in a wide array of sizes, configurations, and color schemes, and against a variety of grounds. Although he warned against its indiscriminate application, encouraging readers of the style book to carefully consider the trademark as a completely integrated element of the overall design solution, Beall's guidelines allowed for considerable flexibility. They also gave designers wide latitude to choose from a startling array of 18 colors, rather than the 1 or 2 colors typical of later corporate identity programs. And finally, whereas most identity programs prescribed 1 or at most 2 corporate typefaces, Beall specified 3, 2 serif, Century and Clarendon, and 1 sans serif, Inland Gothic. He argued that type design should be determined not by fixed rules, but rather by considerations of legibility and readability. He further acknowledged the effects that different paper stocks and printing processes, for example, offset versus letterpress, might have on the appearance of printed type. Effective type design therefore required the designer's discerning and expert eye. Beall's style book thus allowed, or rather required, the designer to make creative decisions when implementing the design program. Paul Rand's work for the Westinghouse Electrical Corporation offers another instructive example of how ideas about corporate identity, manifest in the pages of design manuals, changed over time. In 1955, prior to hiring Rand, Westinghouse's advertising department printed this short pamphlet, which sought to establish graphic standards while at the same time permitting wide variety in the appearance of the company's trademark and logo type. In 1961, Rand produced the spiral-bound Westinghouse Graphics Identification Manual, which, in addition to presenting a new corporate identity, also enforced greater restrictions around its implementation. In contrast to the company's earlier manual, Rand prescribed only 4 permissible iterations of the W symbol. He also designed a custom Gothic typeface, notable for its distinct ST ligature, which could not be used in any word other than Westinghouse. And finally, Rand specified a single primary color, Westinghouse blue, which could, however, be combined with a secondary color chosen by design staff to suit a particular design problem. Rand's Westinghouse manual appears in relation to Beall's work for Connecticut General as a further stage in the standardization of corporate design. Although it took a similar form and retained the designer's signature, though not his biography, it enforced tighter protocols around the use of the Westinghouse trademark logotype and corporate color. It even contained a section called Use of the Manual, which emphasized the need for standards and practices in order to unify and strengthen the company's image. Despite its rhetoric of standardization, the Westinghouse Graphics Identification Manual resisted associations with conformity and uniformity, which post-war critics associated with corporate culture. Quote, "These few elements are merely tools for creating a cohesive corporate identification. They are not meant to hamper individual initiative and creative thinking, but to encourage it," end quote. The Connecticut General Style Book contained a similar statement, advising readers that, quote, "It is not practical or, for that matter, advisable to attempt to limit the use of company-accepted visual elements, such as type, trademark, colors, to confined areas of design," end quote. This kind of language became ubiquitous in corporate design manuals after 1960. It aimed not simply to maintain the possibility of creativity within a corporate design program, but also to establish the system itself as a stimulus to creative thinking. While operating within the constraints of the identification system, in-house designers could nevertheless exercise creative thinking by combining prescribed design elements into workable configurations. Now, certain types of corporations posed particular design challenges. In the mid-1960s, Burtin created a brand identification manual for the Upjohn Company, a major pharmaceuticals manufacturer that offered a wide range of brand name medications. While Burtin acknowledged that some of the company's product promotions were effective, it lacked, quote, "overall association of brand handling to unite all products as part of the Upjohn line," end quote. Now, to help formulate a new system of brand identification, Burtin conducted an exhaustive visual inventory of the company. He collated the promotional materials for each medication, as you see here on the left, and assessed them according to 9 criteria: Upjohn identity, product identity, design quality, typography, illustrations, color application, format, printing quality, and originality. And you can see in the top right, the graphic visualization of his analysis. So the promotional materials for this particular medication, Medrol, were actually quite effective, according to Burtin, falling mostly into the excellent and good categories. So the demonstration of the new system being applied, which you see at the bottom right, isn't so different from the existing samples. Kaopectate's promotional materials, on the other hand, fell mostly into the uneven and unsatisfactory categories. So the example of the new brand identification system, shown on the bottom right again, attempt to spotlight the Upjohn and product identities using bold typographic elements in less cluttered composition. But really, this system of brand identification hinged on a relatively simple graphic mechanism: the use of the Upjohn logotype to the left of the brand names, which were already recognizable to consumers and were therefore allowed to retain their individual characters. And so once again, we see this effort to balance graphic standardization on the one hand with a sense of flexibility on the other. And like Connecticut General and Westinghouse, the Upjohn Manual gestured to the importance of creativity with its stated aim, quote, "to permit the freedom in layout and copy approach that is vital to successful promotion of different products," end quote. Now, at this point, if we were all actually on RIT's campus, I would gesture across the quad to the Vignelli Center for Design Studies, which in addition to the papers of Massimo and Lella Vignelli, also houses the records of Unimark International, a design firm that Massimo co-founded in 1965. And I know Jennifer is in the audience, and I'm very grateful to her, Jennifer Whitlock, the archivist there, for facilitating my research there a couple summers ago now. Now, the design methods that Unimark employed were largely similar to those of design consultants such as Beall, Rand, and Burtin, as well as other design firms such as Lippincott and Margulies, Tremaif and Geismar, and the Center for Advanced Research in Design. Unimark was unique, however, in its international ambitions, in the scope of its design and marketing enterprise, and in the speed with which it adapted to the emergence of computerized design. And it's this last point that I'd like to explore further in the time I have left. Because if, as I'm suggesting, corporate designers reimagined creativity as the controlled combination of graphic elements, then computers offered an exciting new form of creative control. Unimark designers took an early interest in computer-aided design, or CAD software, a technology that became commercially available only in the mid-1960s. And here I'm showing you examples of Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad computer program, a key CAD predecessor that Sutherland created for his PhD thesis at MIT in 1963. Prior to the advent of CAD, designers relied on the painstaking process of manually drafting camera-ready mechanicals, or PASTEPs, that is, completed designs that were ready to be photographed by a stat camera and subsequently printed. Even the creation of a simple letterhead required the careful measuring, rendering, and placement of typographic elements. And this labor is evident in Burtin's process for creating a page of typographic standards for Upjohn's brand identification manual. After first organizing characters on a page of tracing paper, Burtin, or more likely an assistant, cut up sections of type and pasted them carefully onto a piece of paper. This camera-ready mechanical was then photographed to create the final page of typographic standards, a version of which you see on the right. Even though CAD software did not immediately or entirely replace these hand drafting techniques, it did significantly accelerate certain stages of the design process by offering designers a precise time-saving tool. Now, in the late 1960s, Unimark established an Information and Design Systems division under the direction of Richard Branham to explore the possibilities of CAD software. According to Branham, while designers were adept at creating individual objects, they often, quote, failed at the systems level, where design must be considered as an integral function within the marketing, merchandising, management system, end quote. To improve the designer's ability to operate on this larger systems level, Unimark partnered with Cybernetics, a Michigan-based timeshare computing company. The goal of the partnership was to develop computer-aided design programs for use by Unimark and its clients. One publishing-related initiative used computer programs to help manage the tedious task of laying out and typesetting pages for publication. After setting up the program, the designer simply input information and the computer automatically formatted the pages according to the stored typographic standards, a sort of digital corporate design manual, if you will. Another program called the Advanced Remote Graphic Display Scope sought to transform product design from a quote-unquote handicraft procedure using an accelerated sketching system. The program allowed designers to input XY coordinates into a CRT scope and view the forms in three-dimensional perspective. The resulting computer-generated designs were then plotted by a high-speed plotter at Cybernet's computer center. According to Unimark, the computer thus took over the routine tasks associated with design, quote, freeing the designer to do what really interests him, end quote. All of these programs promised to save time and resources while elevating the quality and quantity of Unimark's output and, supposedly, liberating its designers in the process. Despite this promise of freedom, designers were understandably concerned by these automated processes given their unfamiliarity with computer programming as a technology, as well as the changes to design practice that it heralded. Yet Branham argued that while designers often perceived the very phrase computer design as a threat to creativity, they should instead view computers as tools that only became operative in the hands of capable designers. Quote, the computer creates nothing, but forces logical and more careful organization of problems to which creative design can be applied. Instead of a relatively crude intuitive approach, the computer forces the designer to acquire a disciplined approach to his work, end quote. In other words, the question was not whether computers or any other type of system posed a credible threat to the designer as a creative individual, but rather how these systems transformed the very concept of creativity from a supposedly intuitive to an emphatically disciplined endeavor. By combining, codifying, and reiterating fundamental principles and procedures that were theoretically applicable to any visual system, corporations and corporate designers produced a veritable systems theory of design, which reconfigured designers' attitudes toward creativity and control, and reaffirmed their roles in shaping the corporate visual environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. This is just so fascinating. And I think what was really appealing to me was the way that you're uncovering all of those material, all of this information, and the way things were perceived at the time. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about today's practice. I mean, and how that, has it changed anything in the way that you see, or could this inform in a new way just today's practices?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Shani. You know, I'm really interested in talking to designers, you know, going forward with this research, you know, practicing designers. There are a number of programs in integrated design now at MIT, at the University of Texas, Austin, at USC, for example. And I'm really interested to know if they have a sense of the sort of historical you know, roots of the practices that they're sort of employing, and also to see, you know, where they fall, you know, ideologically in terms of this relationship between creativity and control. My sense would be that these aren't understood as, you know, binary terms or opposing terms as much now as they were in the past. And I think that's largely due to this sort of conceptual work that these designers like Beall, Rand, and Burtin were doing in the 50s and 60s, and as well as these organizations like Unimark. I haven't done that work yet, the talking to practicing designers. You know, I was hoping maybe some might be here today and might have ideas about this sort of relationship between creativity and control and how they navigate that in their own practices. But that's absolutely an avenue that I'm excited to explore with this work.
I had a question about our architecture, and obviously CAD is something we associate really strongly with that kind of that wing of design. So I really was curious about the simultaneity in the adaptation, both of the idea of integration in design and also in some of these tools or systems, as you suggest.
Another area that I haven't really explored yet in terms of the architecture side of things. I would think that, you know, these architecture firms, especially the major firms like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, were also early adopters of these systems. They were, you know, not cheap or easy systems to adopt. So Cybernetics was a timeshare computing company. So this was before even corporations or certainly individuals, but small companies, small firms could afford this kind of software, so they time-shared it. So I think that probably the way that this entered into architectural practice, like in design practice, was through large firms. And yeah, that's another area that I think I need to explore further in terms of architectural practices that, you know, also I think were standardized, of course, earlier, you know, before these technologies emerged. I think maybe in contrast to design, I think that there's a sense of architecture systems engineering, of course, is so vital to architecture practice, very early on.
I was just thinking about the power of the archives, the fact that those things are accessible and you are able to go through them and dig out all this fascinating information. Do you see this as a part of the design curriculum, design history, something that design students would benefit from, kind of looking forward, as a more educational, as an educational tool, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two aspects to that, which is that sort of objects, the manuals, which I think are, even when I was there at the Cary in the fall, I saw students coming in and using, and for classes on corporate identity and graphic design, right? I think they're a really valuable resource to see how, but to also consider in a historical sense in terms of how, these practices changed over time. That's something that I was trying to, get at with this talk, that these standards didn't get implemented, immediately or uniformly across the board, right at the beginning. They sort of evolved in a sense over time. And so I think that is useful in terms of thinking, where can, design students, practicing designers today take these kinds of practices and evolve them in other sort of new ways. The other part of that is the sort of correspondence, the notes, the sort of, textual material that is also so rich in these archives, especially Beall's and Burtin's. So much of my research and my understanding of systems as being important at this point was coming not just from the objects, the manuals themselves, but from the writings, the notes, the unpublished books. So I think that's another really valuable resource that design students can and should take advantage of, in terms of thinking about their practice, conceptually. There's, I think, an important conceptual part to design practice. It's not all, hand-based, so.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. So the question is, can you tell a little bit about the relationship between system thinking in design and the European tradition, Bauhaus, Herbert Meyer, constructivism, etc.?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there's definitely a strong relationship in that a lot of these, or at least some of these figures, were emigre designers in the US from Europe, and brought over, Burtin, for example, brought over important design ideas from, the Bauhaus, the Bergbund, these sort of organizations. And even Egbert Jacobson, who, who is the designer for Container Corporation, who started the International Design Conference in Aspen, who many believe was a German emigre, but actually was born in New York. But he was nevertheless very much, interested in Bauhaus pedagogy, and, friends with Gropius and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who started the Institute of Design, the new Bauhaus in Chicago, right? So there's a sort of direct line between, the ideas that were, emerging in Europe in the sort of first half of the century and those in the second. I would say that one of the differences between the systems thinking that I'm dealing with is that it was much less materials based. The Bauhaus pedagogy in particular was so rooted in these different materials, the workshops around, material practices of design. And in a way, this kind of systems thinking of in relation to corporate design, corporate identification that I'm looking at becomes, dematerialized in a way, which I think we see even in that sort of amazing Beall image, right, where he's showing the sort of optical, you know, activity involved in creating and perceiving designs. It becomes more sort of a visual than a sort of material phenomena for him. So yeah, that's a sort of preliminary answer to that question, that very rich question. Thank you.
So I was kind of wondering if you feel like this kind of the conclusions and things that you were able to learn from your research can actually go back to this present discussion about what is art and what is design in our days.
Yeah, that's fascinating because, you know, in this period that I'm looking at, there's a lot of sort of ambivalence or tension in terms of, you know, professional, you know, categories. People like Herbert Bayer calling themselves artists, designers, or designer architects, or there are a lot of hyphenated names for these professions, right? Because, and I think it's part of this, you know, trying to navigate this relationship between what I'm calling creativity and control, between the sort of intuitive and the sort of methodical, that, you know, there's certain value to this term art and artist, right, that they are not necessarily willing to let go of, and is different from the associations that they're attaching to design and designer, or to art and architecture. And so I think, I mean, there's even a point in which Herbert Bayer at the IDCA in Aspen says, you know, we need a completely new term for what we're doing. Like, none of the terms that we're using, artist, commercial artist, even designer, none of these are actually encapsulating what we are and what we're doing. And so, you know, I don't know necessarily what the implications are for that, but I think, you know, there is in the present, but I think there is, as you're suggesting, a sort of sense, a need to return to the values inherent in this term art and artist, right? Maybe, you know, design has become so systematic that there's a sort of turn back the other way. But yeah, I mean, I think that sort of ambivalence, the sort of terminological importance of who these people are, has been important for decades, certainly.
Yeah, I agree. And I love the artist, the designer as a cyborg, kind of thinking through today's lenses and, you know, how much all of our lives are involved with technology. To think of, right, again, right, the first days of this and the fear of it is just fascinating. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is yeah. Oh. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, you mentioned these, you know, the other part of this is that these technologies have become, the sort of march is towards greater user, like usability, more streamlined user interfaces. The aim is to make them accessible to ever sort of larger populations, right? Which of course suggests a sort of deprofessionalization of design. So I think that is potentially another, you know, complication for designers. It's like when their practices are that they had built up as these sort of standard professional, skill-based, you know, knowledge-based practices, when those are becoming, you know, available to everyone, that possibly, you know, requires a certain return to this ideal of art and artistry, of aesthetic sensibility and ability to discern, you know. But yeah, just another thought on that.
Yeah. And I did have another thought, a question, and I don't know again how much of this you were able to see, but I was very curious about the role of women designers in that era. And I was wondering if I know that you've mentioned in your previous talk Miho's archive and the fact that you were able to find relevant things there. So if you care to say more about that, or were there any other women designer that you came across?
Yeah, so yeah, Tomoko Miho was certainly a key designer in this period. She and her husband James Miho worked for Container Corporation initially, and then when John Massey took over for, I'm going to be throwing a lot of names at you now, so apologies, it might get confusing. But when John Massey left, when John Massey became director of design at Container Corporation after Ralph Eckerstrom left to form Unimark with Massimo Vignelli, he created the Center for Advanced Research and Design, which I mentioned, and Tomoko and James became sort of key figures in that. So, and her work absolutely along the lines of this sort of systems thinking. She designed for Amtrak, so really sort of complex signage wayfinding systems for Amtrak, among others. And then, jumping across from CARD, or the Center for Advanced Research and Design, to Unimark, Lella Vignelli was Massimo's wife, and there's a sort of odd dynamic in that the Unimark sort of banned spouses from, especially higher level positions in the firm. But that, of course, I think for anyone who knows Lola Vignelli, that did not dissuade her by any means. She became involved as a consultant and then a sort of employee later on. I believe Jennifer might be able to firm up details here. But, and there were other women, of course, involved at Unimark as well. Pat Sieben was there from the beginning in 1965 for many, I think, even until the end of the company. So yes, there were absolutely women designers and women designers who were involved in this kind of systematic approach to design. It's funny, Beall actually created a sort of promotional material that's in the Cary's collection in his archive. That's a sort of list and celebration of women designers. I'm forgetting the year that it was made. But I do think it can take a bit more digging to uncover this important work of there are also, important, Amelia is going to tell you now, important collections at the Cary of women designers, several, so.
Oh, thanks. I just, I was really excited, and, it's, I think because of people like you coming to use our collections and the word getting out. But just this summer, I was contacted by somebody who's doing a reproduction request from the Burtin collection, and she had interviewed a woman named Betty Haft, whose name does not appear in the Burtin collection at all, but she worked in Burtin's studio for years and years. And so I just put in the chat to everybody keep their eyes out, because Princeton Architectural Press is putting out this selection of essays about women in design, and sometimes they're working in these great large studios like Beall or Burtin's. And the book is going to be called They Were There Too. So I'm really excited to kind of fill in these histories at least. Thanks.
Pat Kirkham has put out a really great book on women designers as well. I'm forgetting the full title of it, but.
This is great. It's very exciting. And thank you, Amelia. We have time for one last question from Breslau. So I'll just go ahead and read it. Is designing today system-based? On the one hand, it looks like a systematic one, but it is not. Classic modernist approach, still teaching such an approach is helpful as a base.
Yeah, I mean, not being a practicing designer myself, it's difficult for me to say, how design is, taught or practiced today exactly. But I will say that even in this sort of period where this language of systems was so sort of dominant, I think one would question how could and should question how systematic it actually was, especially in relation to, it was modeling itself on, scientific experimental research, methods, and sort of managerial methods, which were, we would say, much more systematic than these sort of design techniques that were being employed. So I think, there's one part of the question is how systematic are they trying to be, and the other is how systematic are they actually, right? And so, yeah, again, I'm excited to talk to some of the designers and instructors in these programs of integrated design in particular. The other place I would refer us to is the design program at Stanford, right, which I think is known for its sort of systematic design pedagogy, universal design pedagogy.
Thank you, Robert. This was so eye-opening, and I feel like I could talk about this forever. Thank you so much for this, Robert, and we will be looking out for to hearing more from you on this subject. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And I hope to see you again on our next events. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Amelia, Steve.